Permaculture Part 1. In this video I'm going to be talking about permaculture, and this is going to be an introductory video into permaculture, and there are two very good books on it, so I'm not going to go into an awful lot of detail at this moment, although we may drill down on some of the actual principles that I'm going to talk about in a minute. And there are 12 principles that are the basis for permaculture. And permaculture has been around for quite a while. So a lot of the phrasing around permaculture, as you'll see in a minute, isn't probably what we would say today. You know, they don't use the word recycle, but they mean recycle, for instance. But anyway, for me, so what does permaculture mean for me? Well, I've always said it means about more permanent planting rather than, you know, ripping everything out each year and starting again the next year. And that may be true, but at the end of the day, that's also, you know, some plants we just need to grow as annuals, particularly some vegetables. So for me, it's about a sustainable garden. Sustainable in the sense of using my own seed, growing perennials where I can, taking cuttings, that sort of thing. So making, you know, ultimately bringing in as little new material as possible. And permaculture works on the basis of using the location to its best of ability. So that can be about using sunlight. Well, it can be about putting solar panels up, or a little wind farm, or if you've got a river nearby, or a brook where you could use a micro hydro, for instance. So it's about using all of the facilities that the site gives you to actually come along and generate something that's useful. It also involves looking at the site from the pure geology. So where does water move on the site? If you've got a sloping site, we all know water goes downhill, but where does it go downhill? Does it go follow a path? You know, does it spill over out of, let's say, a bed, and then work its way down a path? Where does it move? Where does it congregate? Where, and you by looking at where it moves and where it collects, you've got different conditions. You know, the wet area might be better suited to having a pond there, for instance, or those plants that like a lot of water, like willows, for instance. So it's about using the site in the way that the site lends itself to, rather than necessarily changing it wholesale. And we've talked about, you know, that perennial planting, but that has an impact as well, because you want to make sure that they are planted in the right place. Tall plants, for instance, will shade smaller plants. Now that may be, in a hot climate, what you want. So you might be wanting to grow some beans and then grow something that doesn't like it quite so hot on the other side of the beans, so that they're shaded. I live in a fairly northern clime, and quite frankly I need as much sun getting everywhere in my garden, but I still bear in mind where I'm going to plant some of those taller plants so that they don't impact some of the smaller ones. And obviously we wanted to do this organically, not use pesticides. And so at the end of the day, it's about being as much chemical free, and I've talked about that and you know, mini predators and stuff in other videos. So the first of the 12 principles that I want to talk about is observe and interact with the site and nature. And by that I mean just sit and listen. You know, when I first bought my first house, everybody said don't touch it for a year, because you don't know what's planted, you don't know what's going to come up, you do, but it's, you know, as you get older and you get a bit more experience, you know whether when you start digging and you hit a set of bulbs, for instance, okay, let's dig these bulbs up, or are they where I want them to be for next year? Whereas probably when I started gardening, I think, oh, what are these things? You know, you need to understand what's, you know, can you tell the difference between a tulip bulb and a daffodil bulb, for instance? The second principle is about looking at the energy, and permaculture doesn't just think of energy as, you know, sunlight or wind power or whatever, although it does include those, but it wants to talk about more about the energy flow. So in terms of, you've got water moving around the site, that has a push with the water, so that's a form of energy. It could also be, what energy are you going to bring in? If you've got people you're going to bring into your garden, perhaps to help you or whatever, what energy are they going to be putting into the garden? So you look at energy in the wider sense, not just that narrow one that we tend to use for the terminology of today. And I think that's quite interesting, because, you know, things like feng shui also look at energy and energy flows, and we don't always pay enough attention to some of these, shall we say, historical traditional practices that perhaps we should be doing. The third one is obtain a yield, and this can be anything from a crop. You know, you've grown some lettuces and you can harvest them. Great, you've generated a yield. So in other words, a garden shouldn't just be a place where you sit and cogitate. You should be aiming to also generate a yield. And if we look at this in terms of the wider landscape, that could also include things like growing willow, if you've got a damp enough area, and then harvesting that to make sticks. It could be things like growing fruit and nuts. It could be growing, having animals. You know, if you've got small holding, it could be about having sheep or chickens or rabbits or whatever is appropriate. So, you know, think about that generating a yield. Even if you're only, you know, if you're not sure about that side of things, try it with some herbs to start with. The fourth one is apply self-regulation and accept feedback. And this is really about your own perceptions and how you deal with things. People will make comments and will pass their own views, shall we say, and you might not like them. They might even be a bit hurtful. But have that self-regulation to not react to it, not pass it on. You know, somebody says something to husband says something to wife because husband's been upset. You know, so don't pass that on. It's about that interaction, and it certainly comes back to when you're interacting with a community, because communities, by their very nature, are very diverse, and there won't always be that common philosophy, viewpoint, whatever. So permaculture says, you know, all these views are valid, but it's what you do with them. We talked about renewable resources, but that is very much key to what permaculture is all about. So principle number 5 is looking about renewable things, and I would take it to these days, we'd sort of use the reuse, recycle, composting, all of those sorts of metaphors. So when you've got some, let's say the outer leaves of your lettuce, you know, you're going to put them back into your compost bin, whereas you're going to eat the rest of the lettuce. So you're not going to be throwing it away. And so, you know, another one is, the next one is actually don't produce any waste. And that's what I'm quite keen on. You know, yes, I do use plastics. You've seen me plant up things in plastics, although I've got a device I'm going to try out and see how I get on with that. But I find that for seedlings in particular, they do work well. But I'm not keen on single-use plastics. You know, if it's not going to give me 2 or 3 years of service, I'm not going to be buying it. And I don't buy more than I need. If I'm, you know, I know how much I can generate to fit into my garden, which isn't a, you know, it's a standard 3-bed semi, so it's not huge. But I do make the best use of it by cramming as much in as I possibly can. So, you know, bear that all in mind. You know, it's about how you use or don't use plastics, if you're going to be using plastics. But it's true of anything you're going to be using in the garden.